Hey guys, tonight we're diving into your life as a medieval defecation inspector. And no, it's not cute. It's weird, it's wild, and you probably wouldn't last 10 minutes without crying or getting fined in barley. Seriously, you're about to live your worst nightmare, and it's all for the honor of ensuring the streets of medieval towns stay, kinda sanitary. So, let's say you're suddenly transported back in time to the year 1300. Forget your 9 to 5 job, your coffee breaks, and that little cubicle you hate. Instead, you're now decked out in some itchy woolen tunic, which already feels like it's been soaked in mud and disappointment, tramping through narrow, filthy streets in your sandals, which are definitely going to get ruined. More on that in a second. And guess what? Your job? Defecation Inspector. Yeah, you're literally the medieval equivalent of a public health worker. Your main task is to ensure the village isn't overwhelmed by human waste. How glamorous, right? Honestly, it sounds like a prank job you'd get in an old-timey horror show. Imagine you're walking down the street, and instead of the sweet smell of fresh air or some bakery bread wafting your way, it's the pungent stench of human waste, animal droppings, and maybe a dead rat for some extra seasoning. Now, here's the fun part. As a defecation inspector, you don't have a cool medieval title like Sir Poop Slayer or Baron of the Back Alley Dung. Nah, you're just the poor sap whose sole job is to make sure people aren't tossing their bodily functions straight out their windows into the streets. This wasn't just some fun, side gig. It was a necessary evil that no one wanted to do but everyone needed. Historians still argue whether any governing body officially recognized this role, or if it was more of a hey, you look miserable, so you're doing this now kind of thing. But you're getting paid in barley. That's right, barley. Can you think of a worse form of currency? It's like getting paid in, expired coupons or participation trophies. So, you're trudging through the streets, barley in hand, praying the next pile of poop doesn't stick to your sandals. Oh, and speaking of sandals, we need to talk about the sensory overload you're experiencing. The streets? They're barely streets. More like filthy, open-air sewage systems with random human waste splattered everywhere. You're not walking on cobblestones. You're walking on discarded food scraps, manure, and poop. Now, your sandals, which you'll quickly come to hate, are not designed for this. They're made of rough leather, and guess what? Those little grooves in your sandals? Perfect for trapping goat pee. So as you're squelching through this hellhole, with every step, you're greeted with the scent of urine and regret. It's 100% goat pee. It's always goat pee. Your feet are absolutely soaked in it. But what really makes this job special isn't just the smell. Oh no, it's the fine barley you get for missing something. Did you overlook a pile of waste by the market square? Here's your punishment, another 10 pounds of barley. Does barley make up for all the misery of your day? Not really, but you'll take it because what else can you do? Buy a loaf of bread? Good luck, my friend. That barley isn't worth nearly as much as a fresh loaf of medieval stale bread. You're broke and drenched in waste, but hey, at least you're technically a vital part of the medieval sanitation system. And this brings us to an unfortunate truth. You cannot escape the smells. Medieval hygiene wasn't precisely what you'd call advanced. Forget everything you think you know about soap or clean clothes. If you were lucky, you'd get a dip in the local river every few months. To wash off that lovely smell of unfiltered sewage. Was it a bath? Nah, it was a social event for the whole village to dump their waste, scrub off the filth, and pretend they didn't just wade through literal toxic muck. That's right, a poisonous wasteland. Medieval sanitation was about as sophisticated as a bucket of water and a prayer. Historians still debate whether medieval people were aware of germs or simply extremely fortunate that their immune systems could fight off the plague every other year. One thing's for sure, though, they were definitely not down with regular hand washing. Nope. If you were lucky, you might have seen a local town crier walking around in the middle of the square yelling something like, "Keep it clean, people!" It was like a medieval version of a health inspector, but with zero qualifications. But back to you, brave defecation inspector. You're trudging through these muck-covered streets, and guess what? You get another fine for letting some peasant dump his waste in the wrong corner. He didn't even wait for the designated waste spot by the public pit, because why would he? He's not getting fined. Oh wait, you're getting fined. In barley. Again. Now, let's talk about the mental image of your day-to-day life. Your job technically sounds essential, but in reality, you're stuck in this endless cycle of feeling like you're part of the problem, not the solution. The streets are crowded with people who have no idea that the poop inspector is walking through them. They assume that's everyday life. Back in the day, people didn't really care if their neighbor was throwing human waste into the street. They were more focused on surviving their subsequent encounter with the plague. The average person had the mindset of, oh, this whole thing is garbage anyway. Why bother? Historians will still argue whether these defecation inspectors were a necessary evil or just a glorified, I'll do it because nobody else will job. And honestly, I think it's the latter. Your whole job is making sure that people don't make the situation worse, but also making sure that you're not getting infected with something that could send you off to the plague pit. And here's the kicker, you probably won't survive this job, at least not without a few near-death experiences from plague rats and getting too close to that open-air latrine. But hey, you'll get your barley payment in the end, right? Before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location in the comments below. Bonus points if you're watching this while pretending to work, we've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. Alright, let's pick up where we left off. You're still in your medieval getup, covered in grime and goat pee, and your sandals? Well, let's say you can kiss them goodbye. They were never meant to survive this job, much like your soul after experiencing the horrors of medieval waste management. If you thought walking through mud in modern sneakers was bad, wait until you step into medieval waste. The stuff that will be stuck to your feet is the kind of nightmare you wouldn't wish even on your worst enemy. And I know what you're thinking. Sure, medieval times weren't exactly clean, but how bad could it really be? Oh, buddy, it isn't good. The streets in medieval towns weren't paved with gold. They were paved with filth, and you, my friend, were the one responsible for making sure that filth didn't spill into someone's home, or worse, the village well. Picture this. The town square, usually the busiest part of the village, is covered in this weird mashup of human waste, animal droppings, spilt food, and whatever the local blacksmith decided to throw out that day. You've heard of a sticky situation. But this is a literal sticky situation, and your sandals are stuck in it. It's that kind of moment where you wish you were back in your cushy, normal job, like an apprentice to the blacksmith or someone who sorts potatoes. Anything but this. But don't worry, because we're just getting started with how this job is about to ruin your life, one step at a time. You're wading through this human slurry, yeah, we're calling it that now, while trying not to get it on your legs. Because, and here's where it gets even worse, this is a full-body experience. As if the smell of waste wasn't enough to have your eyes watering, you now have the distinct pleasure of having your tunic brush against walls that have been covered in weeks of excrement. And don't even get me started on the occasional rogue rat that decides your leg is a perfect resting place. I mean, you might be thinking, okay, so things are gross, but it's fine, I'll survive. Sure, if surviving means traipsing through mud while trying to pretend your life isn't a complete mess. The reality is your sandals are ruined, and the next time you try to walk in them, they'll have about as much traction as a slip and slide. Which, considering the situation, is actually too much traction. I'm talking about slipping and sliding through this medieval cesspool like it's a water park, but, without the fun. And you'll notice it everywhere. These poor, sweaty peasants are doing their best to pretend that this is a regular occurrence. The local butcher? His feet are just as bad. The baker? Oh, she's practically swimming in a pool of spilt bread dough mixed with sewage. But the worst part is when you pass by the hygienic public latrine. A glorified pit covered in wooden planks where men and women both relieve themselves. Now, for a brief moment, imagine what happens when you fall into that pit. Go ahead, take a second. I'll wait. You're picturing it, aren't you? Historians still argue whether these public latrines were anything short of medieval torture devices. Some say they were built to maintain hygiene, but most people would argue that they were more like dungeons for the unfortunate. You'd sit there trying to handle your business, while some guy 2 feet away from you drops his cargo and simultaneously throws his discarded food into the same pit. And when you thought things couldn't get worse, you spot a rat scurrying across your lap. Nope, 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 nope. And let's not forget about your medieval wardrobe. You're wearing those sandals, but you also probably have woolen socks that get soaked in mud. That's right. The same woolen socks you'll have to wear again tomorrow because there's no way to wash them without going to the town river, which is, unsurprisingly, also used as a public toilet. So you're walking around, utterly disgusted by your own feet, while trying to maintain some semblance of dignity as you enter the local tavern to get your next pay in barley. Not only do your feet stink, but now your tunic is clingy with poop residue. You're the inspector, the hero of hygiene, and you look like you just stepped out of a mud pit with a side of rat guts. But hey, the barley's good, right? Historians also debate the effectiveness of the defecation inspector. Did you really stop much of the waste from spilling into the streets? Was your presence there just a token gesture to make everyone feel better about the fact that nobody really cared about hygiene? I don't know. I don't think historians have a clear answer, mainly because they're busy trying to figure out why medieval people thought it was acceptable to have random holes in the streets for personal hygiene. The bigger question is, why was your job even necessary? It seems like a classic medieval mess. Sure, let's create a job that literally no one will want, and then make sure that job involves walking through human filth for a few grains of barley. Seems like a cruel joke that could have come from some medieval version of The Office, right? So, here you are, trudging through filth, your sandals ruined, your dignity gone, all for a wage in barley that won't even buy you a decent meal. Medieval life is rough, especially when your job is literally making sure that people don't toss their feces into the streets, which, trust me, was actually considered progressive for the time. The job well done moment? Probably when you avoid the plague and don't contract some weird medieval disease from the raw sewage you're wading through. But hey, at least you didn't fall into the latrine, right? So, before you decide to comment, remember, medieval hygiene was a whole vibe, and your sandals will never, ever be the same. Alright, now that you're mired adequately in the filth of medieval life, let's talk about something else equally revolting: medieval hygiene. Spoiler alert, it's definitely not what you're imagining. Imagine being that defecation inspector walking through the muck all day, and then, when the workday is finally over, you get to go home and not take a relaxing shower. Instead, you get a pleasant, comforting experience with some cold water and maybe a splash of herbs if you're lucky. Forget about the luxury of scented soaps or fancy bath oils. Medieval hygiene was about as close to a public health horror story as you can get. Now, I know what you're thinking, but surely people bathed at least once a month, right? Nope. Let me shock you, my friend. If you were lucky, you might get a quick dip in a local river, but that was only if you weren't already waist-deep in sewage. This is not your luxury spa day. This is nature's worst. Let's break this down. People in medieval Europe had an unusual, almost spiritual obsession with cleanliness that didn't involve soap, scrubbing, or any other method that would remove grime. Instead, the focus was on prayers, oils, and using unusual herbs to try to mask their rankness. And if you were upper class, well, you'd smell like roses, or at least fancy roses, because you could afford perfumed oils. And by oils, I mean lard, because that's what they used in medieval times. Historians still debate whether people in the Middle Ages viewed bathing as an act of moral purity or a dangerous endeavor to be avoided at all costs. Some think they avoided it for fear of contracting diseases, because obviously, if you step into a public bath, you might be stepping into a plague-infested cesspool. But honestly, there was also this bizarre superstition that dipping your body into water could open your pores and allow evil spirits to enter. Can you imagine the medieval priest telling you, "Don't bathe, evil spirits will possess you"? So, here you are, after a long day of inspecting human waste, praying you don't get cursed by some ancient water demon. Just pray your feet aren't the next target. If you wanted to avoid the scent of doom, and I mean, who wouldn't? You could always use the go-to medieval solution: herbal baths. The most popular choice? Rose water. So, yeah, you may have smelled like a medieval garden, but don't think for a second that the layer of poop under your nails wasn't still present. You were masking it. Let's be real. In a time when personal hygiene was less about soap and more about superstition, your medieval bath might end with you being dunked in a bucket of water that was used for everything: drinking, cooking, and cleaning. Maybe there was even a rat swimming in there, and you didn't notice. The whole bathe in your own filth thing? Completely normal in the medieval world. Hygiene was viewed more as a privilege for the wealthy, as the more elite one was the more access to oil, herbs, and incense one had, which, let's face it, made you smell less like a garbage heap. But don't think that just because you're lower class and poor, that means you're totally on your own in the filth department. No. The entire village was filthy together. The poor, the rich, the peasant, and the knight. They all had their own version of a bath. Your village's solution? The communal bath where you could relax in a swimming pool of germs, next to your fellow villagers, just trying to survive until someone invented soap that actually works. But here's where things get even worse. Even if you were the type to step into the river or dip your feet in the town's public water trough, which was basically a free-for-all flushing station, there was a serious issue. Public latrines. These, my friend, weren't just toilets, they were toilets where everyone gathered. In fact, you might have thought you were doing your business in private, but no, chances were a few dozen people were watching you. No shame, no privacy, just feces, rats, and awkward silence. It's no surprise that after a long day of being a defecation inspector, you'd want to bury your head in the sand rather than face another medieval bath. Of course, rich people had more options for hygiene. They could afford expensive perfumes, and they might even go to a private bathhouse. But just because you're rich doesn't mean you escape the filth. The upper crust of medieval society actually spent time with their nobles in these swamp-like pools, soaking and relaxing in a mixture of herbs, perfume oils, and enough bacteria to give you nightmares. So, even though they might have looked fresh and fancy, they were still swimming in filth, just with better-smelling filth. Is there any greater historical irony than this? Historians still debate whether medieval people were aware of the dangers posed by germs. Did they know germs existed? Or were they unquestioningly hoping the plague wouldn't come knocking while they took a communal bath? Was there any understanding of disease transmission? Some argue that they did know enough, but they were too focused on spiritual purity to think about cleanliness in the modern sense. Others believe they were just genuinely confused about how to keep their bodies clean, and honestly, after a hard day of poop inspection, could you blame them? And don't think you're off the hook. Let's face it, after the workday you still need to get your daily dose of bathing. So, you head to the public bath with the same water used by everybody. And then, you're dunked in that water, sharing a communal rat-infested river bath with the entire village. You emerge, probably covered in disease, but with rosewater-scented oil. And that, my friend, is as close as you're going to get to luxury. Alright, let's get back to your job as a medieval defecation inspector, where things are about to get even weirder and less financially rewarding. So far, you've been wading through filth, trying not to fall into a latrine, which, let's face it, seems inevitable, and dodging rats in your stinky sandals. But now we get to the cherry on top of your career, the barley fines. You think your paycheck is bad now? Wait until you realize that your punishment for not being thorough enough in inspecting waste isn't a slap on the wrist, but a hefty fine in barley. That's right, barley. Not money, not silver, barley. It's like they thought, hey, let's make this job more miserable by giving our poor defecation inspector payment that can't buy him a loaf of bread or anything useful. Why not just toss a few pounds of grain in his face and call it a day? So here you are, trying to do your best in the most unpleasant working conditions, and if you miss one pile of waste, bam, barley. Imagine this. You've been trudging through the muck all day, checking the waste piles, avoiding open sewage pits, and trying not to pass out from the stench of decay. You spot an unmarked waste pile in the middle of the street. Perfect, right? Wrong. You missed it, and that's when your barley fines kick in. You get fined in barley. Why? No one knows. However, it's medieval times, and apparently they were pretty fond of this grain-based punishment system. Your salary is now a mountain of barley that's worth about as much as a thank you card from the king. The kicker? You can't even eat the barley. You're supposed to hand it over like it's somehow more important than your ability to survive the job. How's that for a weird medieval twist? It's ironic in the worst way possible. You're surrounded by waste, your feet are soaked in goat pee, and if you happen to overlook one disastrous pile of excrement, the consequence is more poop. Only this time, it's in the form of barley fines. And you think you'd get sympathy from the higher-ups? Not a chance. The local lord or noble, who has probably been sipping wine and lounging in a filthy bath all day, would rather throw you into another pile of poop than give you a pay raise. You don't even have the right to defend yourself because everyone thinks you're lucky even to have a job that doesn't involve throwing dung at the walls for fun. But here's where things get even more absurd. Punishments didn't just stop at fines in barley. No. There were actual laws governing how people were punished for poor hygiene, or if you did the unthinkable, like tossing waste out the window onto the street. Some towns had rules like, if you throw your waste in the street, you get a fine, and if you don't pay it, we'll throw you in the stocks for everyone to laugh at. Because nothing says medieval justice like a good old-fashioned public shaming, right? Oh, and those stocks? Yeah, they were exactly as uncomfortable and dehumanizing as they sound. You're stuck in a wooden contraption, looking like a human piñata, and your neighbors get to throw things at you while laughing because nothing says good hygiene like a bit of public humiliation. Historians are still debating whether the barley fines were just a quirky legal system or whether they were designed to ensure that everyone stayed in their filth. After all, if you're stuck in a world where your punishment is more grain and not actual currency, you might decide, you know what, I'll keep throwing my waste out the window. At least I get paid in barley. Who could blame you? But let's be real. Barley fines weren't just some medieval version of PayPal. They were symbolic in the worst way. They were meant to remind you that your job wasn't just about keeping the streets clean. It was about making a difference. It was about making sure everyone else stayed filthy and didn't dare complain about it. Because in the medieval world, the best way to ensure hygiene was to make sure your entire town smelled so bad that no one questioned anything. Because honestly, how bad could it get when you're all equally disgusting? You, the brave Defecation Inspector, might be the only one trying to bring some semblance of order to this chaos. You're the one dealing with the mess, but everyone else? They're watching you drown in barley, stuck in the mud of medieval bureaucracy. And that's the kicker. The system was so broken, it didn't even matter if you did your job well or miserably. Either way, you're still getting fined in barley. If you were trying to make a living with barley as your paycheck, you'd be better off becoming a baker, because at least then you'd get real food. Maybe even some bread. But no, not you. Instead, you're stuck with barley, rats, and public humiliation. So, next time you think your job is bad, remember medieval defecation inspectors were getting paid in barley to wade through literal filth for the glory of making sure the town didn't fall into an even more disgusting mess. And honestly, at the end of the day, that's just classic medieval logic. Screw the poor guy, pay him in grain, and expect him to clean up the unimaginable mess that everyone else refuses to touch. Let's talk about what might be the biggest problem you, as a medieval defecation inspector, face every day. The plague. Yeah, it seems like it came out of nowhere, right? But trust me, this is a workplace hazard you weren't really prepared for. So there you are, trudging through filth, trying to avoid any particularly disastrous piles of waste, when suddenly your worst nightmare comes to life. The thing you were never told about, the big, nasty, plague-infested germ factory your job just so happens to exist inside. You're working in a literal cesspool of bacteria, and we're not just talking about a little sniffle here. No, I mean the Black Death. Here's the thing. You, dear inspector, might be trying to keep the streets clean, but the roads aren't exactly on your side. The Black Death, aka the bubonic plague, doesn't care about your barley fines or your heroic efforts to prevent waste from spilling into the streets. It's gonna find you anyway. You're about to find out why your job, which already sounds like a joke, is going to end in a literal death sentence. Let's delve into the science for a moment. And I know it's not something you ever wanted to study while avoiding a pile of human waste. But in the medieval world, your average person didn't really know about germs. They just knew stuff like, hey, if I go to the market and grab an apple from the vendor, I'll probably get sick and die. But hey, at least I didn't get a fine in barley today. Here's where things get tragic and a bit gross. The rats. You didn't think we were talking about your shoes getting gross, did you? No. Rats, those cute little garbage disposal units, were the carriers of the Black Death. And where were the rats most likely to hang out? That's right, in the filth. They were in the sewer systems, lurking around the waste piles you were supposed to be inspecting, spreading fleas. Fleas that carried the bacteria that would kill you faster than you can say, plague. It's like living in a time where your job description guaranteed a slow death. Medieval people weren't stupid. They knew something wasn't right. But instead of thinking, Hey, maybe it's the filth in the streets causing all this disease. They decided it was probably God's punishment or the work of evil spirits. They weren't thinking about bacteria because science hadn't quite caught up yet. They didn't know that every rat they saw hopping around the market or sneaking through the slums was basically a walking biological weapon. They didn't know that by just existing near filth and waste, they were inhaling and touching everything that would eventually kill them. So, while you, the defecation inspector, are trying your best to keep things relatively under control, there's a literal ticking time bomb of disease just hanging out in the same cesspool you're forced to navigate every day. It's the kind of job where you're not just dealing with the unpleasantness of human waste, but also with the very real possibility that the plague is about to snatch you from this gross existence. Now, let's talk about the real kicker. Your job didn't even give you any real protection. Sure, you might have had your tunic and your sandals, but there was nothing to keep the germs out. You were literally walking through a breeding ground for disease. And as if the threat of rats and fleas weren't bad enough, you had the public latrines, where you're not only battling your way through filth but other people's infections. Because if there's one thing medieval hygiene lacked, it was the concept of isolation. No quarantine, no personal space, just feces and fleas everywhere you look. So, let's say it's the middle of a long, hot summer, and you're on your second round of inspecting waste piles for the day. You're starting to feel dizzy, but it's just the heat. Perhaps you've been inhaling too much of the stench and need to take a break. You drink from the village well, which, let's face it, has been tainted for centuries. And then, bam, fever. Within a couple of days, you're dead. The plague doesn't care if you were trying to do your job. It doesn't care if you were doing the best you could in an impossible situation. It's a silent killer that spreads through the air, the rats, and anything unwashed. Historians still argue whether the people back then understood how disease spread, but let's be honest. If you're living in a medieval cesspool, chances are you weren't concerned about the science. You were trying to get through the day without stepping in too much waste, and failing miserably. The plague was like a horrible game of Russian roulette. You're just doing your job and then suddenly you're dead. It doesn't matter that you're out there, knee-deep in waste, trying to help clean things up. And while it's totally tragic that you, a humble defecation inspector, could lose your life to such a horrible disease, there's something deeply ironic about it all. You're walking through human excrement all day long, making sure no one's doing anything worse, but meanwhile, the actual danger is silently creeping up on you in the form of bacteria. The very thing you can't see is the thing that'll end your career and your life. So, the next time you think your office job is unsafe, remember, at least you're not working in a medieval cesspool, where the worst thing that could happen was not just stepping in poop, but getting a plague you didn't even see coming. Medieval food laws. You thought that the worst thing about your job as a defecation inspector was the rats, the fleas, and the plague, right? Wrong. I want to introduce you to the wildly absurd and bizarre food laws that existed alongside your job. Laws that were not concerned with ensuring the food was clean, but with controlling waste in a way that would absolutely ruin your lunch if you thought about it too hard. Ready? Let's dive in. Now, when you're working as a defecation inspector, the last thing you want is food-related complications. But here's the thing about medieval law. It was chaotic. Like, imagine trying to run an entire kingdom while also managing poop in the streets, and then realizing that you're still going to have to enforce food regulations that make absolutely no sense. You thought hygiene was weird? Well, wait until you hear about medieval laws that said if you threw your food scraps in the wrong place, you could get slapped with a fine. Yup, you might be in charge of making sure the streets are poop-free, but apparently it wasn't just human waste you had to worry about, it was every scrap of food too. For example, one ridiculous law from the Middle Ages stipulated that if you didn't dispose of your food waste in a proper manner, i.e., in the designated waste disposal area, which was more or less just a dirt patch in the corner of the street, you could be punished, mind you, by being fined in barley, again with the barley. Here's the thing. People were constantly tossing their food scraps everywhere. Leftover bread, rotten vegetables, animal carcasses. The streets were practically a buffet for rats and any other creature willing to make a meal out of the leftovers that were literally everywhere. So, who was supposed to regulate this? You, the defecation inspector. Can you imagine the absurdity of it all? There you are, already knee-deep in human waste, and now you're supposed to keep an eye out for rogue cheese rinds and bread crusts being tossed out of windows. You're literally fighting two battles, one against feces, and the other against food waste. And if you don't do your job right, here come the barley fines. Just when you thought it couldn't get worse. But the bizarre food laws didn't stop there. Oh no. Some laws actually regulated what kind of food you could throw out if you were trying to keep the streets a bit less gross. For example, rotten meat was deemed particularly illegal to throw into the street, because apparently that attracted more rats, and honestly, no one wanted to deal with giant rat infestations. But if you thought that was the worst thing about medieval food laws, guess again. Some laws dictated what you could eat, based not on whether the food was sanitary, but on whether it was the correct type of food. Historians still debate whether this obsession with what was being eaten was actually a genuine health concern or if medieval lawmakers were merely paranoid about people consuming the wrong kinds of food. In fact, there were laws in England that dictated what peasants could eat on certain days of the week. No, seriously. Do you struggle with deciding what's for dinner every night? Try living in medieval England, where the church dictated what you could eat on each day. Monday, meatless. Tuesday, maybe you can eat fish, but only if it's been blessed. Wednesday, oh, you're in the clear. Go ahead and have your roast chicken. You've earned it after all those prayers. These dietary restrictions were so specific that they practically had you following a medieval food pyramid, except it was more like a list of sins and punishments. And don't get me started on the medieval banquets. While you, the poor defecation inspector, are sloshing through the streets with your barley fines, the nobles were feasting on things like roast swan and peacock, and not just eating them, but parading them in front of their guests like they were works of art. At one particularly famous medieval banquet, guests ate boar, goose, and dormice, which are basically the medieval equivalent of a squirrel, all while bragging about how many courses they could handle. Meanwhile, back in the streets, you're just praying you don't step in a pile of waste and get fined more barley. But wait, there's more. Remember how I said these laws didn't make much sense? Well, this one is the real kicker. There were laws about public vomiting. Yes, vomiting, as in the grossest thing that can happen at a medieval dinner. If you vomited in public, you could be punished for it. Why? Because apparently puking in public meant that you had some disease, and that could cause a health scare. So, imagine this, you're trying to keep the streets clean of waste, and you're walking down the road when some poor guy pukes on the cobblestones, and now you've got to deal with him being fined for his stomach contents. There's no end to the madness. And here's a fun fact for you. Medieval tavern owners were actually punished if they served poor quality food that led to food poisoning. Can you imagine the stress of being a medieval tavern owner? You could get fined barley, again with the barley, if you served someone a bad meal. Now, not only do you have to avoid public vomiting laws, but also ensure that you're not serving anyone food that could make them uncomfortably ill. All this is happening while you're busy trying to keep the streets from becoming a wasteland of food scraps, human waste, and rats. But it's okay because you've got your barley fines to keep you motivated. Oh wait, that's right, you can't buy anything useful with barley. So, next time you think your food might be a little questionable, remember at least you're not living in the dark ages, where your public vomiting and bad food could land you in serious trouble. And at least you don't have to deal with rotten meat laws or puking punishments. A win in modern society, right? Let's take a brief break from poop, rats, and plague talk and dive into something that sounds more like the plot of a bad sitcom than an actual medieval law. The law of the cuckold. Now, you might be thinking, what could this possibly have to do with your job as a defecation inspector? Oh, it has everything to do with the absurdity of medieval society and the weird, convoluted laws that existed to control the lives of the common folk. Spoiler alert. This law is as bizarre and humiliating as you can imagine. So here's how it goes. You're living in a small medieval town, minding your own business, probably stepping around horse manure in the streets, when your neighbor, who's clearly got too much time on his hands, goes to the local lord and complains that his wife has been unfaithful. This complaint doesn't just result in a private conversation over a cup of wine. It results in legal action. Yes, in medieval times, infidelity wasn't just a matter of personal shame or broken relationships. It could actually be punishable by law. Now, hold on to your sanitary sandals. I know, you can't actually have them because they're caked in mud, but imagine. If a man's wife was caught cheating on him, he was allowed to bring a formal charge and demand reparations. But it wasn't just a matter of the husband getting a divorce or calling it quits. No. He could legally claim that his wife had dishonored him, and then, get this, the local law would allow him to humiliate her publicly. The law was so extra that it even included things like branding the woman's face with a mark that indicated her status as a cheater, because nothing says fairness like a little medieval branding to remind everyone of your personal tragedy. It's like a public scarlet letter, but with the bonus of a legal system behind it. Oh, but the fun doesn't stop there. What if it wasn't just the woman at fault? What if the man was cheating? Well, in that case, the law of cuckoldry got even more convoluted and humiliating. You see, the medieval solution to this problem wasn't just a slap on the wrist. Oh no, they thought the public humiliation of the man was necessary, too. The accused cuckold could be forced to wear a ridiculous hat, a horned hat to be specific. Yes, you heard me right. A man caught in the act of being cheated on would have to parade around town wearing a horned hat, symbolizing that his wife had horned him. Yes, that's an authentic medieval expression. Imagine walking around trying to live your life and then being forced to wear a hat with horns on it. This is literally the medieval version of a bad joke that everyone laughs at, but at your expense. What a great way to make a dude feel even worse. Historians still argue about whether the law of the cuckold was actually effective in terms of deterring infidelity, or if it was just an excuse to humiliate people publicly and create even more ridiculous social status symbols. One thing's for sure, medieval law didn't shy away from putting everyone's business on public display, whether they liked it or not. You can't go a day in the village without hearing about who was wearing horns or whose wife was caught sleeping around with the village blacksmith. And let's not even get into the innuendo involved in the word choices surrounding cheating. It's all rather cringeworthy, and the fact that this was sanctioned by law makes it even worse. Now, let's get back to you, the Defecation Inspector, whose job it is to walk through the dung-filled streets and ensure that people don't toss their business into the village square. But just for a second, picture your life in the middle of this cuckold drama. If you thought inspecting poop was a hard job, imagine the pressure of dealing with someone's marital drama while trying to dodge rat infestations and make sure everyone's waste is correctly disposed of. You have to manage poop literally, but you also have to be privy to the entire town's gossip about who's cheating and who's wearing horns. No one cares about the waste management systems when there's a scandal involving husbands, wives, and public humiliation. But hey, you've got to give credit to medieval laws. They sure knew how to keep people entertained while you were busy risking your life in disgusting waste pits. And let's be real, it's probably better to be the one with dirty sandals than the one parading around with horns on your head. Public humiliation was clearly a socially accepted form of entertainment. As a defecation inspector, you might be covered in filth, but at least you're not wearing a horned hat because your wife has been a little too friendly with the blacksmith. Historians still argue whether the whole cuckold law was necessary, or if it was just a way for the nobility to remind the common folk that even in the worst circumstances, someone else was going to get embarrassed more than they were. You, the humble defecation inspector, get to sit back and watch it all unfold while trying not to step in literal waste. But hey, you're getting your barley fines, right? So it's all fine, don't get too close to the horned men. Trust me on that one. Alright, let's talk about the big leagues of medieval defecation inspection, Charlemagne's court. Now, you might think Charlemagne, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, would be too busy making history to care about something as disgusting as waste management. But nope. In fact, even in the royal courts of the most powerful empire in medieval Europe, they had to deal with the same poop problems that you, humble defecation inspector, were facing. It's like the ancient version of everyone poops, but with more bureaucracy, more drama, and a lot more fleas. So here you are, traipsing through the grand palace of Charlemagne, surrounded by gold and tapestries and important people, and yet, somewhere behind all that luxury, there's a poop problem brewing. The royal court might have had all the fine food, expensive clothes, and delicious wine, but it was still sitting atop a disgusting heap of medieval hygiene issues. Charlemagne himself might have been out conquering kingdoms, but even emperors can't avoid the natural consequences of eating. You know what I'm talking about. And when that happens, who's left to deal with it? You, the defecation inspector, of course. And if you think royal waste management was fancy, think again. They didn't have a modern plumbing system in the palace. No. They had latrines, which were basically glorified pits, often shared by many people. Imagine having to inspect those latrines as a defecation inspector. How glamorous your life must be. You're walking around in the most opulent court in Europe, yet you're still dealing with the same grossness you'd find in a village toilet. The only difference is the accents and the amount of gold around you. So, what happened when Charlemagne's court wasn't up to par in the poop department? Oh, there were rules, of course. But these weren't your typical throw it in the pit and move on rules. No, the royal court had specific inspections to make sure waste was disposed of properly. You couldn't just go throwing your leavings around and expect to get away with it. Charlemagne, ever the stickler for discipline, had a team of court-appointed inspectors. No, not just you, the big shots were involved too. They were supposed to keep things clean, but I'm guessing things weren't always perfect in the royal latrines. Imagine trying to keep things pristine when you've got noblemen sneaking in extra servings of roasted meat and a ton of wine. Neither of which is particularly helpful to the digestive system. Spoiler alert, royals weren't any better at bathroom habits than peasants. But the real kicker, Charlemagne, despite his military prowess and his empire's awe-inspiring bureaucracy, still couldn't rectify the fact that his palace was essentially a stinking biohazard. Even though he commanded massive armies and managed huge territories, there was only so much he could do to keep his royal latrines from becoming a cesspool of filth. In fact, he had to rely on specialists, probably not you, but someone like you, to make sure waste didn't overflow into the most prestigious parts of the palace. Maybe they had an exceptional team of poop inspectors who roamed the halls, making sure that royal buttocks didn't leave their mark in the wrong places. A poop patrol, if you will. Historians still argue whether Charlemagne himself was ever directly involved in the inspections, but let's be real, he probably had enough on his plate already. Can you imagine him, after conquering lands and forging alliances, sitting down to personally inspect the palace's public latrines? I mean, I know he was smart, but he probably left that job to someone else. It was likely left to underlings like you, the unsung heroes of the poop world, to quietly clean up after the nobility and manage the hygiene of an empire. But despite Charlemagne's best efforts, the whole empire was still, at its core, a stinky mess of people who couldn't manage their own waste. Sure, he could dictate laws, establish grand ceremonies, and even create one of the most powerful empires in medieval history. Still, even kings were not immune to the inevitable reality of bodily functions. And, let's face it, it wasn't the conquered lands or public discourse that people were most concerned about. It was the decentralized waste and public health in Charlemagne's own palace that really needed attention. If his court had a decent defecation inspector, maybe Europe's most powerful empire could have been a little bit cleaner. So there you are, the defecation inspector at Charlemagne's court, hiding behind the palace walls, doing your best to make sure the royal poop problem doesn't get out of hand. Meanwhile, all the other medieval nobles are sitting around feasting on roast boar, drinking wine, and pretending their waste issues are beneath them. But you're stuck with the poop. And as much as you'd love to pretend that the royal palace was an oasis of cleanliness and that you got a nice paycheck for your noble work, the truth is you're doing the same thing as those poor peasants, just in more opulent surroundings. No matter how much money or power you have, everyone poops, and the dark, smelly reality of medieval waste will eventually catch up with you. Whether you're a peasant or an emperor, the stench of your responsibilities will follow you everywhere. Alright, now we're about to dive into punishments and medieval justice. Yeah, it's as bizarre as you can imagine. You've already dealt with the plague, the rats, the barley fines, and the insane food regulations, but nothing quite compares to the wild punishments medieval society was ready to dish out. If you thought the laws of the cuckold were ridiculous, wait until you see how far people were willing to go for even the most minor infractions. Welcome to medieval justice, where public humiliation and painful penalties were the norm. Let's start with something that sounds like it came out of a grim fairy tale. Imagine you're walking through the village and, out of nowhere, a person is dragged in front of a crowd. Why? Because they've been cursed. That's right, cursed. The medieval justice system believed that some people could cast evil spells, and if you were caught cursing someone, your punishment wasn't just about fines or prison. It was public shaming and soul-crushing embarrassment. You'd be paraded through the streets, sometimes with a symbol of your crime hanging around your neck, like a badge of shame, so everyone would know exactly why you were cursed. You'd better hope your curse wasn't too creative, because you're going to be stuck wearing your mistake. But, of course, things could always get worse, darker even. If you thought the cuckold law was embarrassing, Wait until you hear about the medieval punishments for people accused of witchcraft. We're talking about public flogging, dunking, and, in some cases, burning at the stake. You could be charged with witchcraft simply for doing something as innocent as making a weird herbal tea or having an odd mark on your body. And once you were accused, the process wasn't about finding the truth. It was about making an example out of you. So let's say you survived the dunking, only to find yourself dragged to the public square, where a crowd of angry villagers would cheer as you were stripped and publicly whipped. Not exactly the best way to spend your afternoon, right? But don't think you could just run away and escape all this madness. No. Medieval punishments had a knack for being total social spectacles, so even if you did try to get away, you were going to be caught. You might be stuck in stocks, where you would literally be locked into a wooden contraption for hours, just hoping no one threw something at you, or humiliated in front of the entire village. And it wasn't like you had the right to speak up. If you disagreed with your punishment, you'd be adding insult to injury. These punishments were meant to hurt you in ways that were physical, emotional, and public, so that everyone around you knew that breaking the law was serious business. And guess what? Breaking the law was pretty much anything back then. Even a slight misstep could land you in a world of pain. And then we come to the most tragic and ironic of punishments. Those for theft. If you got caught stealing, you might as well kiss your hands goodbye because your fingers might get chopped off. Forget about simply serving time. If you were caught stealing something small like a loaf of bread, you could lose your whole hand. And guess what? You might not even get a chance to explain yourself. The punishments were swift and final, often decided by the local lord or the village's council of older men who ruled over life and death with minimal sympathy. This brings us to an incredibly dark historical trend. The way medieval justice was often linked to superstition. Say you were accused of doing something wrong, anything from stealing to being a bad neighbor, and it didn't matter if you were actually guilty or not. What mattered was how much people believed in your crime and if they thought it was enough to be punished by something extreme. There's one infamous case where a poor woman was accused of gossiping, yes, gossiping, and was then strapped to a chair, dunked in the river, and pulled out repeatedly. No mercy. These punishments weren't meant to make sense. They were meant to break your spirit. And for the poor souls who were unlucky enough to face them, this was not justice. This was theater, designed to scare the crap out of the rest of the village. But it wasn't just the accused who had it rough. Those who enforced these laws had their own share of weird, even shocking responsibilities. Take, for example, the torture chambers. These places were as savage as they sound. And guess what? You couldn't just show up to a torture chamber and hope you wouldn't get involved in the medieval mayhem. No, the guys doing the torture were there for life and they had to follow orders. The more they inspired their prisoners to confess, the higher their social status climbed. And let's not even get into the cringeworthy instruments used to extract confessions from the poor accused who were forced to sit in front of these sadistic tools. If you were lucky, you'd just be fined in barley for overstepping. But if you were unlucky, you were living through a nightmare. And if the nightmare didn't kill you, the shame certainly would. What I'm getting at is that medieval punishments weren't about fairness or justice. They were about humiliation and public display. A way for the community to keep its power, while reminding everyone that they were constantly being watched. So, if you thought your job as a defecation inspector was gross and ungrateful, remember at least you weren't being publicly humiliated by a ridiculous law for gossiping, or losing a hand for stealing food to feed your family. Medieval punishments were insane, but in a world so full of chaos, you might have just gotten lucky to avoid being sacrificed to the gods of cleanliness. Alright, now that we've survived public humiliation, cursed crimes, and medieval social theater, it's time to talk about one of the most pressing issues you, as a defecation inspector, have to deal with: the plumbing, or more accurately, the lack of plumbing. You thought the barley fines were rough? Try wading through a village's muck where the plumbing is just a medieval version of wishful thinking. I'm talking about a toilet system that makes your modern plumbing nightmares look like the bathrooms of a 5-star hotel. Spoiler alert: if you're lucky, you'll survive long enough to realize that what you're dealing with here isn't plumbing. It's more like a biohazard waiting to happen. So, as a defecation inspector, your first task is to make sure that waste doesn't just end up in the streets or the village square. But where does it go instead? Here's where things get extra gross. Medieval sewage systems were basically non-existent. If you were fortunate, you might have a town with a public latrine. However, I'm not referring to a well-maintained facility with running water and soap. Nah, these were pits, basically giant holes in the ground with no flushing mechanism, just waiting to be overflowed. You were walking around a cesspool. The streets? Those were just a collection of people's business piling up in gross heaps. Now, if you think a nice public latrine was enough to keep things under control, you'd be wrong. These holes were crowded, shared by everyone, and often located in the open air, which meant you had no privacy while using them. Ever tried doing your business while publicly exposed and knowing there's a crowd watching? Welcome to medieval life. And here's the kicker. You weren't even allowed to use a proper seat. No comfy toilet bowl for you. Instead, you were squatting over a hole in the ground, praying that no one decided to drop a bucket of waste on you from the level above. If that doesn't sound like a health nightmare, I don't know what does. If you thought this was just an isolated problem in the poorer districts, think again. Even the wealthier medieval folks were stuck with subpar sanitation. The nobles might have private latrines, but those were still just holes in the floor or crude wooden seats over smelly pits. And guess what? No one was there to maintain them. You think the local lord's household staff had time to clean the mess? Ah, nope. You might be inspecting waste at a noble's palace, but you're also getting a front row seat to the plumbing chaos they've been trying to ignore. Even the most lavish feasts couldn't mask the stench of what was lurking beneath the floorboards. And then, of course, there are the rats. Now, these furry little creatures were more than just the occasional nuisance. They were rampant in these unsanitary medieval settings. Remember those public latrines and cesspits? Yeah, the rats loved those. They practically thrived in the waste-filled pits, eating whatever scraps they could find, and, of course, spreading disease in the process. So, not only were you walking through literal filth, but you were also sharing that filth with rats that probably had the best survival instincts of any medieval creature. These rats didn't just eat your scraps. They were also spreading disease, just waiting to get you infected. Just when you thought you'd gotten used to the smell of goat pee, these rats were waiting to sneak into your waste pile, and then bam, plague. The medieval townsfolk didn't even realize the connection between rats and disease. No one was talking about germs or vectors back then. It was all about superstition and divine will. And if you were the poor defecation inspector, you had to live with that ignorance every single day. Your job wasn't just about preventing people from tossing their waste into the streets. It was about managing a situation that was beyond your control. You were the one stuck in a world where the rats and waste ruled everything, and no one cared enough to change anything. And when you think the rats couldn't get worse, they do. Picture this. You're walking through the streets of your village, maybe trying to stay a few feet above the sludge to keep your sandals clean, when suddenly you step into a puddle. You look down and oh look, it's rat droppings mixed with raw waste. So now you're trapped in a nightmare of rats, disease, and poor sanitation. The whole time, you're just hoping that you don't step on a rat's tail, because that's probably the only thing worse than the stench you've already resigned yourself to. Historians continue to debate the extent of the sanitation system's shortcomings during medieval times. Some believe it was simply unsanitary, while others attribute the Black Death to the presence of rats, according to a trustworthy source. Did they really have a clue that rats were a problem? Or was it just an accident waiting to happen? Either way, it wasn't pretty. As a defecation inspector, you had to live it. You weren't just cleaning up waste. You were doing battle with a plumbing system that was a disaster in itself. Rats, plague, and a lack of proper plumbing. It was all part of your daily grind. So next time you think you've got it bad dealing with clogged drains, remember, medieval plumbing was a mess that involved rats, diseases, and an endless supply of public latrines that weren't going to clean themselves. Oh, and don't forget about the barley fines for every bit of waste that got overlooked. Alright, buckle up, because if you thought the rats and the plague were deficient, you haven't seen anything yet. Now, let's really dive into medieval sanitation, and trust me, you wouldn't survive a day in these systems. Seriously, imagine you're just a regular person, maybe you've got a decent job like a barley collector or perhaps even a defecation inspector, and you think you've gotten used to the stench of medieval life. You've stepped around human waste, danced around squishy street corners, and even avoided getting slapped with a fine, thanks to your magical barley-paying skills. But now you're about to experience the full force of medieval sanitation disasters. First off, forget about toilets. You probably had a nice, comfortable one at home. The one you don't even think about until you accidentally step into something squishy. But in medieval times, public latrines were literally just holes in the ground, covered by some rickety wooden boards. These were shared, meaning you were squatting next to strangers who probably hadn't bathed in weeks. You're dealing with fellow villagers, in all their glory, pooping in unison. And if you thought the odor was foul from just one person's waste, imagine the stench when the whole town is doing its business in the same place. But don't get too comfy just yet, because we need to talk about overflowing latrines. Do you think the toilet paper shortage is alarming? How about a medieval shortage of everything? The waste would sometimes spill over, and instead of magically disappearing down a drain because, surprise, there was no such thing as a real sewer system, it just collected in the streets. You could be walking home, minding your own business, and bam, you step into a pile of waste. Now, this was just the norm. No one thought to take care of it. It was just part of the medieval charm. If you were lucky, maybe someone had built a basic pit to dump it all in, but that's only if you lived in a town that even had such a thing. Otherwise, the village was a giant toilet and you were living in it. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely this was an inconvenience. Wrong. You see, you weren't just dealing with unwashed humans walking around, leaving their poop everywhere. You were living with the constant threat of disease. The rats and the fleas were the apparent problem, but what about the disease-ridden water? If you lived in the middle of a medieval town, the water wasn't filtered, wasn't treated, and sure as hell wasn't safe. People drank water straight from the same well they used for washing their clothes, cooking their food, and sometimes, yes, pooping. Imagine that. 1 minute you're sipping a glass of water, and the next minute you're fighting the plague. The streets themselves were often flooded with waste after a rainstorm. So instead of a pleasant stroll, you'd be trudging through a swamp of decay. And here's the kicker, nobody cared. No one was going to clean up the streets for you. Not the mayor, not the blacksmith, not even the local priest, who was probably too busy avoiding the rats and wondering when his next meal would come. People didn't have the luxury of worrying about hygiene. They were too busy just trying to survive. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, but this sounds awful. But surely, there must have been some bright spot, right? And you're right. Here's the bright spot, the smell. The smell was so overpowering that people no longer noticed it. Your whole world, your whole existence, was consumed by the stench of the waste you were surrounded by. People had grown so accustomed to the smell that they barely noticed it at all. And if you did acknowledge it, too bad you were just stuck with it. Here's an image for you. You're sitting down for a meal, if you can even call it that, of gruel and stale bread while trying not to gag from the stench of human waste wafting in from the street. The rats are feasting on the scraps of food you didn't eat, while the smell of filth clings to your skin. The plague is lurking around every corner, and the best you can do is hope you won't get sick. Meanwhile, you're being asked to make sense of the whole thing while doing your job. And your job? Oh, that's right, it's to inspect the waste and make sure no one is making it worse. Yeah. Have fun with that. But don't even think for a second that it's just people who were suffering. The animals had to live in these conditions as well. Have you ever seen a medieval horse try to walk through the sludge of human waste and waterlogged garbage? It's not pretty. These poor animals were forced to trudge through the same muck you were. The townspeople might have been grossed out by their own conditions, but they didn't care about the horses, so the animals were stuck right in the middle of the mess, dragging carts of supplies through swamps of filth. And don't think that these poor animals didn't catch diseases. There were more plague rats, more disease-ridden waste, and now sick animals. I know what you're thinking now. Okay, now I definitely wouldn't survive a day in this mess. And you'd be right. No one would. Medieval sanitation was basically a death sentence wrapped up in a diseased, smelly, plague-filled package. If you weren't already dead from disease, the waste in the streets would get you. You were living in a nightmare, and there was no escape. The only option? Pray you didn't catch something worse than a bad smell. So next time you're complaining about a clogged drain or standing in line at the bathroom, remember at least you're not knee-deep in medieval waste and living on the edge of survival. At least your plumbing works, and you're not sharing your public toilet with an army of rats and disease. Be grateful. Alright, let's take a step back and look at how far we've come in terms of sanitation and hygiene. It's easy to sit here and laugh at the chaotic nightmare that was medieval life with its public latrines, plague, and rats running amok. But before we go patting ourselves on the back for modern plumbing and clean water, let's pause and think. How much have we really changed? Let's break it down. You live in a world where you flush the toilet without giving it a thought. You drink clean water that has been filtered, chlorinated, and passed through multiple stages of purification. You have toilets that flush, plumbing that works, and the luxury of sanitary wipes at your disposal. But you've also got something else at play here: laws that regulate everything from the quality of food to the efficiency of waste disposal. So, what does medieval sanitation have in common with today's laws about hygiene and public health? More than you might think. Let's start with the basic facts. Back in medieval times, the government's role in sanitation was essentially non-existent. You had a defecation inspector, that's you, but there were no citywide plans to control waste. It was chaos, a free-for-all, with everyone tossing their poop wherever they felt like it. The wealthy had their private latrines, while the poor had to deal with public pits, where they were stuck squatting in front of each other, all in full view of the village. Oh, and did I mention that plumbing was a luxury reserved for the nobles? And those poor peasants? They had to survive by ensuring their waste remained out of sight, but it wasn't exactly clean. Now, fast forward to the 21st century, and we've got a legal system that's built around the idea of sanitation as a public health issue. Instead of everyone just guessing where to toss their waste, we have laws that regulate exactly how and where waste should be handled. In the US alone, there are thousands of regulations governing water quality, waste management, and environmental protection. The EPA exists to make sure our drinking water is safe and that our waste is disposed of properly. Sounds pretty good. Compared to medieval chaos, we've come a long way. However, here's the catch. We still struggle with public waste and sanitation in certain areas. Take, for example, third world countries. They still face the same problems medieval towns did. A lack of plumbing, inadequate sanitation infrastructure, and unsafe drinking water. It's not like we've solved everything. Poverty and poor infrastructure in some parts of the world mean that people are still living with the same diseases and unsanitary conditions we laugh at in history books. Heck, in some places, open defecation is still a common practice. You might think, wait, people are still pooping in the streets in the 21st century? Yeah, they are. And it's the same hygiene crisis that medieval peasants faced every day. In the US and other developed countries, things have improved significantly. We have toilets that don't require you to squat in front of a crowd, and we've solved the waste management problem, at least on a large scale. But let's not pretend that we're all living in some utopia of plumbing. We have sewer systems that occasionally back up, plastic waste clogging our oceans, and toxic chemicals contaminating our water supplies. Modern convenience doesn't mean we've solved all the sanitation problems. In fact, we've just relocated them to other areas where we no longer have to see them. So, the medieval world wasn't that different from our own today. Although they didn't have toilets or flushable systems, the underlying problems of waste management persisted. People still pooped, rats still roamed, and diseases still spread. But we've built a system where, at least on paper, things are better. Waste is collected, treated, and disposed of in a way that hopefully prevents it from harming the world around us. In a way, we owe it all to those defecation inspectors who tried, with all their dirty hearts, to make sure that things didn't get worse. That being said, waste management is still far from perfect today. You might live in a city with excellent plumbing, but somewhere in the world, people are still struggling with medieval problems. The idea that we've conquered sanitation is an illusion. While we no longer live in cesspools of disease, the fight for clean water and proper waste disposal is still ongoing. And if a defecation inspector from medieval times could see how we deal with things now, they'd probably still be disappointed that we're not totally free of disease yet. The rats may not be running rampant anymore, but our garbage still gets out of hand, and that's on us. So, the next time you sit down on your comfy toilet or sip a glass of filtered water, remember, we're not as far ahead as we think. The medieval poop patrol might have been awful to be a part of, but they were doing the same job we're doing today, just with more rats, more plague, and way worse plumbing. Alright, now that you've survived the public latrines, the barley fines, and the plague-infested plumbing of medieval life, let's get into the next level of gross: toilet paper. You think your modern soft, quilted TP is a luxury? Oh, it is. But if you were a medieval peasant or even a noble, you would have been lucky to wipe your backside with anything close to what we use today. In fact, your options for post-poop cleaning were about as comfortable as sitting in a pile of rats, which, if we're being honest, would have been cleaner than what you had to work with. Let's start with what you didn't have: toilet paper. Nope, medieval people didn't have the luxury of your soft rolls of Charmin Ultra or your sustainable bamboo wipes. Oh no, my friend, if you were lucky, you might have had a bit of wool to deal with things. Imagine scooping up your waste with a handful of wool, which may or may not have been covered in goat hair, and just hoping it did the job. It's like medieval DIY toilet paper, except, spoiler alert, it wasn't even close to soft. Imagine wiping with something as rough as wool that's been sitting out in the elements all day. Good luck. And if you were unlucky enough not to have even wool, well, a stick was a popular substitute. Yeah, you heard that right, a stick. No, I'm not joking. Of course, not everyone in the medieval world had the same level of luxury when it came to wiping. Some regions had stones or moss as the go-to tools for cleaning up after business. So imagine walking into your local latrine. Remember? No doors, no privacy, just a bunch of people hanging out over a hole. And you see moss stacked in the corner, just waiting to be grabbed. Moss, the stuff you walk through in the woods. Yeah, that was your version of toilet paper: no privacy, no comfort, and definitely no softness. But hey, at least you didn't have to pay for luxury brands. Historians love to debate exactly what people used in ancient times to wipe themselves. Some say animal fur was popular, others claim that leaves were the MVPs of the era. But stone? Sticks? Definitely real. And let's talk about how dirty that would get. I don't care how many times you dip that stick in a stream, you're still picking up bacteria like it's going out of style. You might have tried to scrub yourself with moss, but good luck getting all the waste off when the moss itself is probably soaking up its own share of dirt. Medieval hygiene was built on the concept of minimalism. You just had to survive the poop, not clean it up in a pleasant way. There was no such thing as soap. Remember, we're living in a time where people thought evil spirits were the cause of disease. And even if you had something like lard or herbal oils, they were more likely to be used for things like sore muscles or skin problems, not for washing your nether regions. Let's not forget that wealthy people didn't necessarily fare much better. Sure, nobles might have had access to fancy things like fine linen, whoopee, but they were still using things like sponges on sticks to clean up after themselves. This wasn't some luxury bathing experience. This was barely functioning hygiene at its finest. And let's hope the sponge wasn't shared between multiple people. Imagine the family reunion at the latrine. Great fun for everyone involved. Medieval people were limited to rough wool, sticks, and moss for wiping. And guess who had to clean up their poop problems while also dealing with this backward method of wiping? You, the Defecation Inspector, whose life was already a mess. You'd probably be slipping and sliding through the streets, trying to make sure people disposed of their waste correctly, only to be greeted by the stench of wool, moss, and all kinds of unspeakable materials that didn't belong anywhere near your body, let alone your butt. Historians debate the extent to which medieval people were aware of personal hygiene. The common belief is that they were still in the dark, relying on superstitions about cleanliness and the importance of a bacteria-free life. And yet, here we are, in a world where our toilet paper comes in quilted layers. We have bidets and flushable wipes. However, medieval society managed to get by with the bare essentials. Did they do it well? Absolutely not. But did they survive? Some of them did. And you, as a defecation inspector, got to watch it all go down. The modern world has undergone significant changes in terms of comfort, hygiene, and technology. But let's not forget that it's built upon centuries of people suffering with necessities like woolen wipes, sticks, and moss. You think you're unlucky to have a toilet that clogs occasionally? Try living in a world where the only thing that stood between you and complete disaster was a bit of wool and a hope that it didn't break apart mid-wipe. Oh, and the rats? Don't even get me started on the rats. So, the next time you sit down in a spotless bathroom, just be thankful that you don't have to use a stick. And if you're ever feeling fancy with your soft TP, remember someone in the medieval ages would have paid anything to have a roll of what we consider the most basic luxury. Alright, let's dig into one of the most cringeworthy aspects of medieval hygiene that you probably wish you could unknow: the absolute chaos of medieval toilets. Imagine this: you've got no privacy, no plumbing, and absolutely no dignity. This isn't the world of modern public restrooms, where you get your own stall, a toilet seat, and hopefully some toilet paper. Oh no, this is medieval waste management, and things were a lot less civilized than you'd like to think. First, picture yourself in the middle of a medieval town. You've just eaten a hearty meal of stale bread and boiled meat, and now, surprise, you've got to go. Where do you go? Well, you've got two choices: the public latrine or the street. The public latrines were open-air affairs, so forget about the privacy you're used to. Instead, you're squatting over a hole in the ground, surrounded by people who are also doing their business. No stalls, no privacy, and no, please wait for your turn. You're just sitting next to a bunch of strangers, in full view of the town, with nothing to hide behind except maybe a bucket of water. Oh, and let's not forget the rat parade in the background. Because why wouldn't rats be hanging around, looking for scraps to munch on while you're doing your business? And let's be clear, these latrines weren't clean. Medieval public toilets weren't like the pristine restrooms of today, which are cleaned every hour. No, these latrines were constantly overflowing. You'd think that by the end of the day, there'd be a pile of waste just waiting to spill out onto the streets. And guess what? That happened. If it rained, you could easily find yourself wading through a river of human waste. Think about that next time you complain about the occasional clogged toilet or overflowing garbage. However, let's discuss the real kicker. Some places had toilets built directly into their buildings. Yes, you'd be relieving yourself in the middle of a room, maybe next to the kitchen or a meeting space where your fellow villagers were trying to get on with their day-to-day lives. Can you imagine having a toilet in the same room where you eat and sleep? Now imagine your roommate deciding it's their turn to, well, go while you're trying to have a meal. Medieval hygiene was a nightmare, and the absolute lack of boundaries meant that no one was safe from the stench and awkwardness of it all. For the rich, things were only slightly better. Sure, they had private toilets, but don't think they were some heavenly throne of cleanliness. These luxuries were just latrines with a bit more decorative flair, often built into the castle walls with a simple chute leading out to the moat or some other disgusting waste disposal system. So, while the peasants had to squat in the public pits, the rich just threw their waste into a hole and then prayed no one fell in. And I know what you're thinking. Surely people were using something to, clean up. Oh, my friend, if you were in the upper class, you might have had some soft wool. Again, don't get too excited. But for everyone else, you likely had to rely on sticks, leaves, or sponges for protection. Imagine you're done with your business and you've got no toilet paper or even a basic cloth. You grab a leaf, which is probably covered in whatever disease is running rampant at the time, and you try to clean yourself as best as you can. And when you're done, you wipe your hands with the same dirty stick or cloth you used. It wasn't good, my friend. Bad hygiene was literally everywhere. And now, imagine you're trying to clean up after yourself in these medieval latrines, where the idea of privacy is non-existent. People had to deal with each other while doing something that we today consider a private act. You were expected to get on with it, shoulder to shoulder, with no judgment or privacy. If you had to go during a village gathering, you'd have to leave the feast and go to the nearest latrine, and everyone knew why. And if you didn't make it to the latrine on time, well, you'd be stuck walking through town with your shame exposed for all to see. The public latrines weren't just a place to poop, they were a social hub. Seriously, people would gossip, exchange news, and even engage in discussions while squatting side by side, relieving themselves. Privacy, that was for the rich or the lucky few who had a private latrine built into their homes. But for the rest of you, too bad. If you had to go, you did it in front of everyone else, sometimes with a crowd watching you. If your neighbor could handle it, so could you, right? Historians still debate whether these open-air latrines were merely necessary evils or an example of medieval social norms that prioritized the communal over the private. Some argue that they were just a convenience, while others think they were more a sign of class. A way of saying, hey, if you're rich enough, you can poop in private. But if not, well, welcome to the party. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but the public latrine was definitely a cornerstone of medieval life in the worst possible way. So, The next time you complain about the awkwardness of a public restroom or a clogged toilet, take a deep breath. You might not have a flushable toilet with privacy, though we should all be thankful for that, but at least you're not squatting next to your neighbors while trying to avoid rats. Medieval toilets were as wildly public as they were disgustingly unhygienic, and you were lucky if you survived the experience with just a twinge of embarrassment. Be grateful that your biggest problem is waiting in line at a public bathroom, not wading through human waste in a hole shared by the entire town. Why you might be better off as a medieval jester. Let's wrap this up with a bit of a twist. After all the misery of rats, plague, and the horrors of medieval sanitation, you might be thinking, hey, this job of defecation inspector sounds like it might actually be worse than being a jester. And you know what? You might be right, because when you take a moment to think about it, life as a jester might actually be better than being stuck in the trenches, dealing with medieval waste and public humiliation, even if your job was to make people laugh. Let's break it down. As a defecation inspector, your life was pretty gross. Sewage, rats, and the threat of disease constantly surrounded you. You were continually stepping over piles of poop, which, by the way, was probably the least of your problems. You didn't have a comfy desk job, you didn't have privacy, and let's not even get started on wiping yourself with wool, leaves, or sticks. Add the plague, barley fines, and constant exposure to public humiliation, and your job was basically a medieval nightmare that made you want to find the nearest rat hole and crawl in. No thanks. But the jester? The jester had it better, despite what you might think. Sure, their job was to entertain the nobles, and sure, they were still subjected to public humiliation, but they got to be the center of attention without wading through human waste every day. The jester might have been laughed at, mocked, and paraded around in ridiculous costumes, but they were still treated as part of the court. They had a bit of freedom to joke, make fun of the king, and have some fun, all while avoiding the deathly fate of dealing with medieval poop piles. The job might have been ridiculous, but at least they weren't constantly stepping into messes or worrying about getting fined in barley for missing a waste pile. But here's the twist. Despite being the laughingstock of the court, a jester actually had a lot more leeway than the poor defecation inspector. They could poke fun at the nobles, make them laugh, and even get away with mocking people in power. You think you'd have the guts to make fun of the king? The jester did it daily. And while their fate was often humiliating, they still held a certain social power. At least they weren't the ones scraping poop off the streets for barley. Sure, the jester's life wasn't glamorous. They had to wear ridiculous costumes, dance around in front of royals, and be the butt of jokes. But let's face it, they had the freedom of not having to worry about catching the plague every time they walked down the street, not having to step through disgusting muck, and certainly not having to deal with the absolute hell of medieval hygiene. The jester's humiliation was performative. They were paid to be laughed at, to make people smile and forget about their own messes. And that, my friend, sounds a whole lot better than the life of a defecation inspector. Now imagine it. You've spent all day wading through filth, dodging rats, and praying you don't get struck down by the plague. But then, you hear the sound of laughter from the royal hall. You peek inside, and there's the jester making fun of the king's ridiculous wig, making everyone laugh. Even the nobleman who could throw you into the stocks for the tiniest infraction. The jester's job is tough, but at least they get a little respect and social freedom, which you'll never get while inspecting human waste. As a defecation inspector, you're hiding in the muck, punished by fines, and ignored by the nobles who are too busy laughing at the jester. Meanwhile, the jester gets to take a break, enjoy a bit of status, and make fun of everyone while they walk out of the room with a smile. So, yeah, when you're out there getting knee-deep in human excrement, maybe, just maybe, you'll dream of a life where your only job is to make nobles laugh and stay clean. Historically, jesters were not always treated well, and many met tragic fates. But, in comparison to the defecation inspector's life of constant filth, disease, and social obscurity, the jester's life might have had a bit of charm, even if it was just getting a good laugh at the king's expense. They were above the muck, at least in a metaphorical sense. In the grand scheme of things, medieval life was hard for everyone. Whether you were stuck with barley fines, battling disease, or trying to survive a royal performance, things were never easy. But if you had to choose a medieval job, being a jester wasn't so bad after all. At least you'd go out with a joke rather than a stinky death. And remember, the next time you think your life as a modern human is tough, Picture yourself in a world where toilet paper was a dream, rats were everywhere, and plague could strike at any moment. No, thank you. We've come a long way, and as bad as your workday might seem, it's nothing compared to the chaos medieval defecation inspectors had to survive.